to start with session 2, energy transition policy updates from Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, and Uganda. I'm standing in for Boitumelo Molete from COSATU, who's sent apologies, she's unwell. And we also, unfortunately, our comrade from Nigeria, from the Power Workers Union, didn't get a visa and is unable to join us. But we do have, actually, there's a third apology for this session, which is Tom Amiti from the Uganda Power Sector Union. There was a misunderstanding with his participation, but Evelyn's from Uganda following the situation closely, so I'm going to ask her to come back up to the front and give us a little report, which she touched on it in her intervention this morning on what's going on there. And Comrade Ernest Nadome from the KETAWU, the Kenyan Electrical Trades and Allied Workers Union. I hope I didn't make a mess of that. He's going to come up and speak louder. Okay, yeah. Do I need to repeat anything? Oh, okay. And we also have Levahang Molete from COSATU, who's heading up the just transition and energy work for the for COSATU. So why don't we try to get started now, and maybe those comrades could come up here. Good. And while they're making their way here, the sort of motive behind this session is to discuss. We wanted to start on day one to put out as much information as we can about the current developments. I think everybody in this room is aware that energy has become so highly politicized, that the developments are moving so fast that part of our job and part of our challenge really is to stay abreast of the different developments going on in different parts of the region. In our view, in the assessment of TUED South until now, there are common features across the continent, but there are also important differences. So we want to pay respect to that and be alert to those differences. They're asking speakers to discuss the challenges and opportunities each country for focusing on the role of trade unions in shaping energy policy, advocating for workers' rights, and promoting a just transition. So different issues in different countries, but some important similarities. So that's the essential kind of reason for this session, the purpose. So if you don't mind, I'm going to start with, we haven't heard from Kenya yet, so I'm going to start with Comrade Ernest, who's, as I said, the General Secretary of KETAWU, recently joined TUED once we were in Nairobi for the launch of TUED South. And there's been some developments there. And we've updated the framing document. Many of you have heard references to the framing document. That document is on our website. It's also was sent out in the invitation. It's a very long, dense document, and it's not meant to be entertainment. It's a heavy read that is constantly being updated because things are changing, but we're trying to develop the kind of facts-based analysis which can allow us to build reliable politics and reliable programmatic commitments. Because if we misunderstand what's happening at the level of energy transition, then we will be like floating out in the ocean without a clear compass or direction. And when we started TUED, we understood the main narrative was that the energy transition to a low carbon future was unstoppable, it's inevitable, and you either get with the program or you will be left behind. And unions, ITUC, others said, we don't want to be left behind. So no worker should be left behind. That's a valid position. But then when you look at the data, what you realize is the climate crisis is not being addressed. That fossil
100%. We also have a Rural Electrification Authority that is also assisting in for those who are in those rural areas and at a subsidized rate. And within the same space, we have the electricity. I talked about EPRA, Energy and Petroleum Regulatory Authority. So generally, that is how the structure is of Kenya, of the structure of electricity subsector in Kenya. On matters, when we now talk about the mix, the electricity, how is this the electricity mix in Kenya? I will not want to delve into details, but I think the most important thing is in Kenya, currently renewable energy. I'll give you just a few statistics. The renewable energy, the numbers we have in Kenya: hydropower, renewable. We have geothermal. Geothermal, I want to say, maybe I'll talk about this, the potential. We have a lot of geothermal in Kenya to the extent that there is a lot to be done in terms of, currently we have we've been able to generate or drill electricity worth 950 megawatts. We also have wind power that is totaling almost 436. And for wind power, we have the biggest plant in Africa, wind power. We have solar, we have biomass, we have thermal, which are mostly owned, but most of these particular plants are owned by IPPs. So in total, we have a whopping 90% of electricity in Kenya is renewable energy. It is renewable energy. The other 10% is fossil fuel, thermal. And the target of the government is by 2030, we should be having 100% renewable energy. I know the challenge that might be there is also the power purchase agreements that the government have signed with a number of these IPPs. So it's something that the government is battling. How do they get themselves out of this? Going forward, in terms of challenges, what are we doing? And maybe something I forgot to mention in terms of CBA coverage. I'm happy to report that amongst these entities, all of these that are in the electricity subsector, the CBA coverage is almost 95%. Yeah, 95%. And we are trying to fight really for the remaining IPPs so that we organize them. So I think so far so good in that particular area. And now with all this that is happening, what are the challenges? What are the opportunities? But even before I say that, I'm happy to report that as a union, we've been engaging like-minded organizations. We have now the Renewable Association of Kenya, where we're engaging them so that we are able now to push the government to advocate for policies that support just transition. Ideally, by the fact that we have almost 90% of power that is from renewable, I think so far so good, but we are not yet. We will want to make sure that the policies that are there are pro-workers. So the challenges, as much as we are doing all that, we have challenges of governance. As these governance issues are bringing in problems related to affordability, where there is corruption, there is interference by the policymakers, the leaders in government in really making sure that they have the right leadership. They're interfering with procurement. There are issues also that are coming up that we are fighting as a union, issues of casualization. We are also facing challenges of contracting out of these services, which we are also saying we have, as workers, we have the capacity to do this. There are issues of efficiency, reliability, and this is where now the common person in Kenya comes in and said, reliable, we want reliable power. And we are pushing the government now to have a stable system. We are pushing the government also to make sure that they allocate enough resources so that these obsolete lines that have been there since independence, they upgrade them. We are also now currently facing challenges of, just like many other countries in Africa and even in Europe, is the issues of inflation. Inflation is really hitting us hard, and that is equally affecting the power sector, where we've got challenges of people who are not paying their bills. The other day, because of inflation, because of the Kenya shilling, or as weakened, I'm sure, and this is happening all over, it has now forced the Kenya Power to increase the tariff. And it's a big debate in Kenya, where currently in the National Assembly and the Senate, the government will want the Independent Power Producers Agreement, PPS, to be revoked. It's a serious matter. Those managers in charge of those IPPs presented themselves in Parliament, and the Parliament cannot accept, because you realize that in Kenya, 1 kilowatt hour, for instance, electricity from the generating company, KenGen, is charging around 5 Kenya shillings. Maybe you can convert that to $1. No, is it 5 US cent? Eh? And then we have IPPs that are charging almost 150 per kilowatt hour. So it's a major ripoff. And the government has tried. This is not the first. It's the second that government that is trying to see how they can revoke this power purchase agreement, but they are watertight. In fact, if you revoke them, it is more expensive to revoke. So it's better to live with it until 0.03 USD. So you can see it's almost more than, in fact, 500%. What IPPs are charging is 500% more than what KenGen is charging. So so this is where we are. The debts, the country is also now highly indebted. The issues of fuel is damn expensive. And now what is the government trying to do? The government now wants to raise money. And their target is one of these companies, these public institutions that are in the energy sector that are doing well. They want to privatize. They want to privatize these companies. And now we are also saying as a union, no, this is not acceptable. We are not going to agree on this. So we are trying. Well, to what extent are we able to do that? It boils down also to the support from the opposition. And unfortunately in Kenya now, the current government has bought also the opposition, the ruling party as a majority in parliament. And as we are here now, the worst is happening in terms of the current government has increased NSSF. They used to pay around 200 shillings. Now employers are contributing 6% for National Social Security Fund, and employees are contributing 6%. Come 1st July, the government now is compelling employees, you must contribute 3% to a housing levy, and employers must match the same. They are also saying, come 1st July, we must now increase our contribution to National Hospital Insurance Fund to 2% of one's basic salary. And as all this is happening, for the last 3-4 years, employees have not gotten salary increment. We are operating in an environment whereby we are hit by inflation. Life is becoming difficult. Electricity is expensive. So this is where we are as a country. But all is not lost. We have positioned ourselves as union. We are saying we are not going to accept this. We'll continue lobbying. And we have even threatened for a nationwide strike so that the government can listen to us. So I think I'll stop there, and maybe during the intervention, I'll be able to respond to a number of questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comrade. Thank you for that, Comrade. Before I hand over to Lebahang from COSATU, I think if there is time in discussion, I remember the presidential task force on the IPPs recommended going to a South Africa style auction system. So maybe that's something we can return to tomorrow in our discussions, because I think that's also true of the recommendations from the Ghanaian government, is that we can lower the costs of IPP generated power through the auction system. And it didn't seem to be too mindful of the crisis of the auction system that are being faced, not just in South Africa, but in many other parts of the world, of not getting financing for projects. But we can come back to that tomorrow. So Level, over to you, comrade, if you will, and tell us what's going on in this rather intense discussions going on in South Africa on energy transition.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks to the TUED for inviting COSATU to be a part of this discussion. While listening to the Kenyan experience, it sounds like we're just another side of the same coin. I think the issues that are prevalent in this transition to a low carbon economy is definitely the privatization of the renewable energy system. And an anomaly is happening here in South Africa, where 100% of renewable energy generation lies in the hands of the private sector. And there seems to be no role for government to play a part. And I think this is done deliberately. When we look at what has happened to state-owned enterprises, and it's not just a case of the last 10 years. I think if we had to be quite honest, since the implementation of GEAR as a neoliberal policy and an macroeconomic policy trajectory for South Africa, that has since seen the weakening of state-owned enterprises over the years. When we opened up ourselves to neoliberalism financialization in our early democracy, those are the key levers that have resulted in the way in which the state-owned enterprises have degenerated to the level that they have. And I think this was done on purpose again, so that the key and critical aspects of our social and public policy then lies in the hands of the private sector. The argument in South Africa is always that because state-owned enterprises are so weak and they've been hollowed out and they have very limited capacity, then the alternative is to bring in the private sector and benefit from efficiency gains within the private sector, which we know is flawed. And we just have to look in other sectors, health sector, to see that actually this did not work. We're also now starting to see it in the energy sector. So with the amendments to the electricity amendment regulation, which ushered in the unbundling again of our power utility ESCOM and allowed for private partners to come into the generation aspect of the power utility and to begin to sell electricity to the power utility, we've also started to see what Kenya is also starting to experience. So the argument from policymakers as well as the various technocrats in this process is that if you have significant competition within generation, this will lower the price of energy. And we know this doesn't happen, because what then takes place is that a few giant players will come together, create oligopolies and monopolies, collude, and then push the price up of whatever service that they are rendering, particularly to the state. So we're well aware of what's currently taking place in South Africa. The issues pertaining to our electricity crisis, I think in the input made by the General Secretary of COSATU talk about the issues of insecurity of energy, as well as the blackouts here in South Africa. This is all done deliberately so that even when there is a discussion around the role of our national power utility as playing a role in the renewable energy sector, those will then be dismissed by the public. I think what's even starting to happen here in South Africa is that public policy, when we talk about the ability of the public sector to be able to do the renewable energy sector generation, we're starting to see a lack of support, particularly from ordinary citizens, because they're buying into the narrative that the public sector is not able to do this work. And this is done deliberately. I mean, all you have to do, you're here in South Africa for a couple of days, all you have to do is to switch on the news channels and see how there's such negative sort of discussion and a narrative and propaganda away from the public pathways. And this is, again, done deliberately so that there's this idea that the public sector has failed. which is not true. This has been deliberately done by the adoption of policies that were not a good fit for South Africa in the first place. So what the trade union movement is doing basically, especially in this area, is to really do the work of tackling capitalism. And this is the discussions that we have in the trade union movement, that, you know, you can't address the climate crisis and climate change through bringing together another form of capitalism. In our earliest articulations in terms of the transition to a low carbon economy, we used to call this green capitalism. TUED, you call this green structural adjustment. It means the same thing, that you can't deal with the climate crisis by introducing another form of capitalism. In fact, it's always been COSATU's view that in order for us to deal with the current climate crisis, we need to look at a future that represents an alternative to capitalism and that has a significant system change in our society. And again, the complete rejection of the private pathway that's currently being shoved down our throats. If we look at the outcomes of COP26 in terms of the Just Energy Transition Partnership for South Africa, it's clear that in those processes and in the IPG countries, which are the countries that are partners to the Just Energy Transition Partnership, is that the onus of decarbonization seems to lie in the hands of deindustrialized and countries that have not benefited significantly from industrialization. And when you raise these concerns in the public discourse, it seems that you are anti the process of transitioning to a low carbon economy, which are myths that we need to debunk. But we need to face the reality that, you know, South Africa has been given a transition partnership from these very industrialized countries. But when you look at the package of what South Africa has been given, it's really been given dollar-denominated debt. In a country that has such high level debt service costs, and we're struggling in a situation where we're implementing austerity, and that's taking away from our social spending because we have such high levels of debt service costs in terms of our fiscus. However, when we have these multilateral negotiations and bilateral agreements with very powerful organizations and very powerful countries, we are being told to decarbonize, but to do this on the basis of accumulating more debt, which really doesn't make sense in the broader scheme of things. But the way in which these are packaged at a multilateral level, it seems as though the global north is giving the global south a gift. But if you were to decipher the Just Energy Transition Partnership and you just looked at the fact that one country, an emerging economy at that, South Africa, is negotiating decarbonization and negotiating a pathway for climate finance, doing it with 5 other giants in terms of economies, it's no wonder South Africa ended up with such a bad deal at the end, with only 4% of climate finance being grants, as opposed to the 96% that will be dollar-denominated debt for our country. So COSATU has been clear, and I think organized labor in South Africa has been very clear in terms of its rejection of the Just Energy Transition Partnership together with the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, because in that particular plan, we don't see the elements of a just transition. And I know in South Africa, they'll tell you that the initial Just Energy Transition Partnership was just a small contribution. It's not the whole thing. But if we were to agree to just the small elements having such lack of justice, it means even in the flows of various other financing, we are to expect more and more injustice as we proceed. The General Secretary of COSATU touched on the issue of what an unjust transition actually means for the Global South. And I think it's something that we should take really seriously, because as the Global South, we've been on the back foot of so much injustice that it's also starting it's also now starting to replicate itself in the way that we're meant to be transitioning to a low carbon economy. We have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to change the way in which the structure of our economy currently is. It's a structure that is filled with marginalization of youths, marginalization of women, marginalization of various other demographic groups in our country. We have an opportunity to change this, but we can't change this if the various mechanisms for us to transition are unjust. We need to tackle these. I'm just going to touch on what we believe the alternative vision is here, especially for us to be able to achieve a just transition. Because I think one thing that we can accept is that even though the just transition as a concept emanated from the trade union movement, there has been significant appropriation of the concept. It means different things for different stakeholders, depending on what their interest is in terms of this noble cause. So business now, because of the profit incentive that exists in this transition, also says that they want a just transition, but we must never make the mistake of thinking that what they mean is a just transition is what we would mean as a just transition. I think what is central for us is to ensure that indeed the public pathway remains intact. Eskom must survive this transition, and it must play a significant role in the transition to a low carbon economy. This is where historically we've been able to have a number of significant labor rights. So we need that institution in place because the workers who work there benefit significantly from the industrial relations that they've historically enjoyed in that particular sector. So it's important to keep workers there. It's important also because if we have a huge society in South Africa with the high levels of inequality, there's a large portion of our communities that cannot pay for electricity. It doesn't matter what we do, they will not be able to pay for electricity. So it doesn't mean that they get to be left in the dark. It means that those that can pay should pay so that we can benefit from cross-subsidization and social solidarity within this particular system. If those that can pay leave the system because of constant blackouts, it means that those that cannot pay are left with a power utility that is basically broke and cannot provide them with the basic necessity for electricity. So we must continue to fight to ensure that Eskom continues to operate, because these are the social ownership models that currently exist in our society, and we must protect them from being dismantled. Ours really is to push for economic transformation towards democratic ownership. This is very important. We can't have a sector that's supposed to produce a public good in the hands of just the private sector. We need sustainable worker livelihoods and well-being. This is the mining and energy sector in South Africa historically has been able to wage industrial action and win in this particular sector. So from a collective bargaining labor market policy trajectory, this must be protected at all costs. And again, we need to create a society that has a low carbon and climate resilient economy. I think these are the three principles that we continue to call for in our policy debates. Now, I'm gonna conclude just now, but I just wanted to touch on the three characteristics of the South African economy that we are mindful of need to be addressed in the transition to a low carbon economy. First, we need to tackle our economy that is significantly based on fossil fuels. And this is historically because of our history as a heavy minerals intensive economy. In fact, I look at the Kenyan example, and I think it's one that's very admirable in terms of how they've been able to amend their energy mix. And this is one we must strive for. We must also strive for addressing just the levels of segregation and spatial development in South Africa. 29 years after democracy, and still workers live very far from central business districts. And this must be addressed. And we can't say that we have a transition to a low carbon economy that is just when these structural patterns continue to exist. We must also deal with the governance in crisis and the role of the state. Corruption has played a huge role in where we find the defunct level of the state currently, and these must be addressed. We want the public sector, and we want energy to be in the hands of the public sector, but we must rid our public sector of corruption, and we must create a culture of good governance so that indeed when the resources of this country are in the hands of the states, they continue to be protected and they serve the needs of our population more broadly. I think I'll leave it there, Sean. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Lebo. Before I call on Evelyn to give a quick report on developments in Uganda, I just want to say that we're having a discussion on the JETPs tomorrow, not more on the sort of, I think we all acknowledge the green structural adjustment elements in the South Africa case, an explicit mention in the agreement. I think it was Article 19 or something. The court said unbundling of the public utility and enabling environment for the private sector is in the agreement, and similar languages in the other JETPs. So I refer you to the document we put out called a preliminary assessment of JETPs that was sent out before the meeting. And we're going to have a full discussion on it again tomorrow in terms of what then is our alternative, the public pathway of the challenge of upfront financing. If so many countries, as we heard earlier today, are indebted, where does the money come from, and what is the role of the development banks in this? And that's why we're going to talk about on Wednesday, at least begin to discuss the idea of pressuring the new president of the World Bank to say, look, the game is up in terms of your attempt, the bank's attempt to impose this kind of investor focus approach to energy transition. We still have massive levels of energy poverty and those kind of problems. So we're going to try to be looking more at alternatives tomorrow. So Evelyn, we've heard a lot about we saw headlines late last year about the renationalization of energy in Uganda, which didn't go down too well with some of the business press, if I remember correctly. So tell us what's going on, and we also invite you or one of your comrades to write a few paragraphs for us so we can get it into the framing document, which is a living, working reference for this project. Evelyn, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sean. Actually, last year, 1st December 2022, the government of Uganda gave a notification to both ESCOM, who are handling their generation under concession, which was signed in 2003, and also Umeme Limited, whose original owners were from UK through Actis, and who also got the concession in 2005. And the government gave them a notification of termination of the contract, in other words, non-renewal, actually, not even termination, non-renewal of their contracts. And what were the main reasons for this? In 2013, the Energy Committee of the government of Uganda was put in place to probe the high tariff costs, which the companies kept on increasing, and then also the challenges of lack of accessibility, especially within the rural areas. The recent report, which was released in 2022, actually shows that in Uganda, only 22.1% of the population has access to electricity. Majority of these will account for about 55 to 56% are found within urban areas, while only 10% of rural folks have access to electricity. The implication is that over 90% of Ugandan populations turn to biomass, mainly charcoal and firewood, for cooking purposes. So there's no access to clean energy. Actually, the statistics show that only 5% of Ugandan population can actually use electricity for cooking. But in terms of energy mix, it's quite interesting that Uganda has got clean energy because hydropower accounts for 98% of its current energy mix, with only 2.1% from fossil fuel in terms of energy mix. So Uganda is actually one of the most endowed countries in the whole of Africa, which does not use fossil fuel. 98% of its energy comes from hydropower. The current capacity is estimated at 2,000 megawatts, but interesting enough, the country only consumes about 800, at most 1,000. The other 1,000 is not used because of the connectivity challenges. So in 2021, the president of Uganda was so hyped, and he asked a question, who signed this contract with these people? Why do you have middlemen that have actually made the prices to go up? And he said, I need this contract terminated. But as usual, the concessionaires had the upper hand. They said, if you want to terminate a contract before the end of the contract itself expires, then you need to pay us the national losses or national profits. And when the government computed how much they would pay in terms of national or assumed profits, it was too high. So they said, let's bear with them until the concessions expire. ESCOM handed over to Uganda on 31st of March, 2023. That is when the concession ended. Interesting enough, they walked away with 12 million US dollars. Yes, check the records, 12 million US dollars as payout for the contract not being renewed. We're waiting to see what will happen to Umeme because theirs is also ending in 2025. But I also want to know that from the onset when the concession was signed, the prices went up. The assumption that efficiency and effectiveness was going to be created as proposed by both IMF and World Bank was not achieved. Additionally, in terms of labor itself, when they came on board, about 1,000 workers lost their jobs. So that is one thing you must always appreciate, and I want to agree with the COSATU representative. Every time privateers come, certain jobs must be lost. But worst of it is that when you lose those secure jobs, then they introduce the element of precarity. Outsourcing, contracting some of the things like, meter reading, talk about installation. These were actually outsourced. So they would only bring them when they need a job. So one of the key challenges from workers' perspective when it comes to privatization is introduction of precarious work without social protection. And you know that all of us need social protection, even as you go out of your work life. One thing we also noted there was that the issue of accessibility also became low, and also the issues of corruption. Because one of the questions people are asking, how could a government sign such a contract that makes the government continue paying for assumed losses if Umeme did not achieve their targeted sales level? The government had to compensate for that. So that became a bone of contention between the government and also the concessionaires. But I would also want to acknowledge that to renationalize was not a simple thing. It took a concerted effort, both from the trade union perspective, trade unions themselves, civil society, and also lawmakers. I remember as Public Services International, before the concession, we were able to build the capacity of our affiliates in Uganda to discuss with the government and warn them about the consequences of going to privatize the electricity sector. But just like the same story with Nigeria, because we also have affiliates in Nigeria. In 2015, when the government was being forced to privatize the electricity sector in Nigeria, our affiliates put up a spirited fight against the same. However, the president of Nigeria then candidly said, I know and agree with you what you're saying that might not work, but my hands are tied. We need bailout from IMF, we need the loan. The conditionality is that we must privatize. And they went ahead and privatized. And you had the statistics was given by the GS from COSATU. Nigeria is paying the price as a result of that. And there's always power blackout, more frequently than before it was actually privatized. So these are the issues that when you look at by the end of the day, sometimes they might push it, but eventually the government comes to regret. Because where a president says, who signed this contract? So you ask yourself, who was in charge? Who were the guys engaged? Because if you look at Uganda contract, the Attorney General was not involved in the signing of the contract. And so sometimes they'll do it deliberately to leave out some of the technical people who tell you the implication, especially the legal implication of this contract if you want to terminate it before its expiry period. And there is something maybe that we need to actually safeguard against, and that is where we come in as workers to be able to hold our governments to account and also ask for public establishment of some of these contracts before they're actually even signed. But more importantly, in terms of workers' perspective, especially for public services, we work among the community. COVID-19 was a good testament in terms of how quality public services can be used to cushion any economy against pandemic, against any crisis. It is quite amazing that in less than 1 year, we're actually appreciating and applauding the public services for really making the economies to stand. Barely 1 year down the line, we have forgotten. We are back to the normal, as if nothing ever happened. And this is where issues of, electricity and energy is very important. South Africa, imagine we're still in the era of COVID-19 pandemic. You need the oxygen to maintain the patients in the oxygen, and there's frequent power outages. The prices are so high. What would actually happen to the citizen? And maybe sometimes people don't understand, why do we as public sector always keep on saying it must be public. We defend and we stand for the lowest members of the community who are not able to afford it, who depend on the government for access. And if you deny them the smallest right because you want to appease the private sector, you've lost your democratic right as a government. And this is always the strongest argument. It's not about being anti-privatization. It's about getting able to get to know where do the private actors end. They can end where there's actually market forces in demand and supply, but not when it comes to provision of public services, which is one way of redistribution of wealth between the poor and the rich. So the story of Uganda is a clear indication that the private push does not work. Let me make some interesting observation. When the government of Uganda decided they were not going to renew the concession, IMF, World Bank, IFC came out very strongly to condemn it. And this was actually the narrative. Uganda is going to lose on the gains that have been achieved for the last 20 years when the private actors came in terms of efficiency. How can IFC, which sits in the UK, and the World Bank that sits in Washington, contradict the president of a country who says there's no efficiency? Who runs the country? And so they kept on giving a lot of threats, the government of Uganda is going to lock the doors for private equity to come into the country because of refusing to renew the concession. The same narrative, it has never changed. I asked a question to one of the lawmakers. If you look at Actis itself, when they came into Uganda in 2005, they borrowed $25 million from IFC, which was actually guaranteed by the government of Uganda. And the payment was contingent on the money they were going to generate from distribution. So the next question is, which money did they come into? There was no private equity injected. The next thing they said is that they got loan from private equity and they were paying high interest rates, double the amount units that they're getting from IFC. IFC gave them the loan at about 6%. The private equity owners were giving them at almost 15%. And majority of the money was going back towards repayment of the loan. Because you know that when you take a loan, it takes the first charge over any other thing because it's part of the expenses. So the money was getting out to private equity owners in form of loan at the expense of the community in terms of high tariffs, among others. So even as ESCOM is thinking, or South Africa government is thinking about, relenting to the push by IMF so that you qualify for the 8.5 billion. And this is a question we should ask ourselves. $8.5 billion against 250 billion. What happens with the other funding gap? By the end of the day, what can 8.5 billion do against the 250 billion that South Africa needs to actually achieve a just transition? Is it worth the sacrifice? That is a question we should actually ask ourselves. But yes, one of the issues we've actually seen that collaboration between trade unions, civil societies, and lawmakers can help a country to actually renationalize their own public sector. And that is very, very important. Lessons learned, they'll always package it as efficiency, effectiveness, attracting private equity. There's no private equity attracted, they actually take it away. I noted in my first submission that when Actis decided to list on the stock exchange, they received 129 million from that transaction, US dollars. Ordinarily, they should have paid a capital gains tax of $34 million US dollars. It was never paid because they rushed very fast to register a subsidiary in Mauritius, which at that time was charging 3% in terms of income tax, as opposed to government of Uganda, which was charging 30%. And this money was not paid because Mauritius and the government of Uganda have got a double tax agreement. So that means you can't tax them double. So by the end of the day, and that's why the linkage between public pathway and tax justice is going to be very critical. Why the issues of the multinational companies paying their fair share of taxes, but also let's plug into the minimum global tax. I know currently it is at 15%, but we still need to push that a minimum should be at 25%, so that it becomes this incentive to register subsidiaries in Mauritius because you want to evade paying taxes from the people you've generated 129 million as opposed to 25 million that they got from IFC. Who was the winner of this? Not the public, but the private. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn, and also Ernest and Lebahan for your interventions here. We do have a little bit of time, I believe. Let me just double check here. We have almost half an hour for discussion now. And so I'd like to open the floor. I think you can use your little red lights, but I don't know if I can see at this angle. And I can't really see very clearly the people out there. I know you're there. I know you're there. So perhaps we can open it up for questions and interventions. Please try to keep them brief, please, and pertinent to the discussion we're having at the moment. Am I missing anybody? I see a comrade here at the front. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
I just thank you very much for the inputs. I just wanted to ask.
name, please, comrade.
Oh, my name is Melisizo Kiso, a researcher at Naledi. So I just wanted to, in terms of the presentation that we received from Comrade Evelyn.
A little louder, comrade.
One?
A little.
Oh, a little louder. My question is, was ESCOM operating as a IPP in Uganda? Just wanted a bit of clarity on that. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Martin Kagwa. I am a researcher from SATRI, which is a research institute of the National Union of Mine Workers. Mine is a question of clarity to Ernest about the Kenyan experience. You said Kenya now operates at 90% in terms of renewable energies. Are you excluding the energy used in transportation, like diesel and so other transport systems? Because I also know that these are very important and carbon intensive energy sources. Just that clarification for now.
Thanks for that question, Martin. Comrade Helder over here.
Thank you. My name is Elder Consolo from Mozambique. Mozambique Trade Union Center, which we call OTM, Mozambique Trade Union Center. There's a confederation, of course. Thank you for brilliant presentation. And I think meeting like this, exchange experience is very high. It's very important, you know. My question is, how is the relationship between the unions in the unions and government? There is a platform that you're discussing issues in which we can take our demands, in particular in this case about energy. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Helder. Brother at the back.
Thank you very much for opportunity. And allow me also to join the chorus by thanking the presenters. Mine is to Uganda. What have led the first instance these companies to enter Uganda, and what have led the president to change his understanding of the presence of the energy provisions in the hands of these companies? Is the old age of teaching my lesson, or is there something concrete came forth for him to rethink? Thank you.
Thanks, Comrade. Hamida.
Thanks, Comrade Shons. I'm Hamida from Naledi, the research arm for COSATU. So let me acknowledge all three presenters. I think the information on the specificities of each country was really, really rich. Coming from a trade union perspective, I think I'd like to hear from the presenters just a little bit more about how the trade union, either as a federation or an affiliate, or as a collective, how did they actually shape the energy policy? Because I think it's kind of there, but I think it would be really good to hear that. I think also in terms of advocating for workers' rights, if we can get a sense of what some of the implications are when you don't have a just transition and how workers, if at all, are being involved to advance a policy. I mean, Lebohang, I mean, you've got a rich experience in relation to our blueprint as well as the PCC involvement and so on. So I think it would really be good if you can share how COSATU is doing that and to hear from others. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Hamida. Thank you. A few questions already. Before I go, I don't want to come back to the table prematurely if there are others who want to come in or any comments or other interventions. Dr. Ali, please introduce.
My name is Dr. Aden Ali from KETAWU, Kenya. Mine is not a question, but a general comment to the panelists and the information that have given us. But just a point to bond and jungle our mind about the discussion in the global sectors, especially the global north, where the discussion is the confirmation of corporate level and national level towards a net zero and decarbonization, which is contrary to the global south requirements, where we are talking about the decarbonization in the context of public pathway. But if you look at what global north is talking about more is decarbonization and accessibility to electricity or to energy, without telling us the best way to have it is through public pathway. Because the options that are available for them is to push for privatization. So they give you one, as my sister from COSATU said, at one hand and pick you from the other hand. So we need to challenge ourselves in the role of the union. And I like my sister has put it very clearly, what is the role of union towards this in shaping policies that we put. So as much as we are here, we need to endeavor to transform our thinking and the people that we lead, the societies that we advocate for a just transition, so that we can put our plans. I know we had a lot of good plans. We need to put these plans into actions. We need to have the right skills in terms of information, of which I think this is a platform of sharing information. We need to build the resources, and we need to pioneer and champion our roles as union without discussing documents, very good documents, and leaving it on the shelves. That is only my advice to anyone who is there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comrade Dr. Ali. Still have time for more questions, I think, before we go back to the table, or even general interventions if they're on point. Seeing none, I think I'll come back to any. I didn't make a note of the specific questions. I assume that the front table did. So can I start with you, Lebohang? I think there was something aimed to you.
Yes, I'll answer the question around how do trade unions shape how do they shape energy policy, and how do we to kind of push for the public path, because there's a lot that the trade unions can do. The way in which we've historically waged our struggles creates the perfect platform for us to now call for a public pathway towards a low carbon economy. I think specifically for the COSATU experience and in South Africa, one of the things that we realized is that we were telling workers to demand a just transition, and we developed really nice policies around this, but we weren't giving them the specific mechanisms through which to achieve this. There are things that trade unions already have in existence, and I think our ability to collectively bargain and our ability to have platforms and councils where we bargain with employers is very important to achieve this. One of the things that we identified in our blueprint for workers is that through making use of collective bargaining councils, you can achieve a just transition. And you can achieve a public pathway towards a just transition. We often talk, we identified 3 sectors where this can happen. We identified mining and energy, particularly because the transition is very much focused on mining and energy currently, as well as transport and the agricultural sector. And what we say there is that through the manner in which you negotiate and you make use of collective bargaining over and above achieving over and above achieving better wages, you can call upon the employers at this level already to start taking you into the planning for their transition for the next 10 to 20 years. And through those processes, start to demand specific demands that will make sure that workers are not left behind in those processes. We have been approaching ESCOM for quite some time. They run away from us, but we have been approaching ESCOM to say, in collective bargaining, in your wage negotiations, how do you table just transition demands to ensure that indeed you don't leave workers behind in terms of the transitioning? And the blueprint helps us to do this, because in our blueprint for workers, we ask workers in these three sectors to envisage an end state. Envisage an end state where there is a public pathway and you do have workers and communities that are not left behind when we have transitioned to a low carbon economy. What does that future look like? And what are the things that we need to do as the trade union movement now in order to be able to achieve that particular end state? One of the things that the trade unions and the workers were actually telling us is that we need job guarantees in sectors where there's going to be a large amount of job shedding because of the transition. And committing that the employers now commit to signing those job guarantees is going to be important so that we do achieve a just transition. A just transition doesn't happen in the context of losing jobs. And it doesn't happen in the context of maintaining jobs. It happens in the context of job creation. So what do we do now to push for job creation and the types of industrial policy in order to get us to that particular end state? So those are the things that the workers have already identified. In the agricultural sector, the issue of land redistribution is being highlighted. So previously, we only talked about wages when we talked about collective bargaining, but workers are also saying in collective bargaining, they want to have the land redistribution agenda in these types of negotiations. At the very least, if there was equitable land redistribution in South Africa, ordinary South Africans could be able to benefit from the energy transition, because you need to put wind farms and solar farms on somebody's land. And by doing that, at least workers can benefit from those rental options. So those are the recommendations that came from workers who are saying that if there is justice in this transition, these are the things that we need to make use of collective bargaining in order to be able to call for. And another thing that's important for trade unions is that historically trade unions, and depending which country you're talking to at a national level, are part of social dialogue and social dialogue platforms. In South Africa, we have NADLEC, and now recently we have the Presidential Climate Commission. And because of the role of the trade unions in those particular structures, you are able to call for more progressive issues. One thing that we can attest to, I mean, when we started in the Presidential Climate Commission, there was no acknowledgement of the role of the state. In fact, when you talked about the role of the state, it was seemed to be some swear word that you are mentioning, because nobody envisaged a public pathway. But now more than ever, there is an added recognition that there's an important part for the state to play. And these can only be realized because the trade union is there. It's represented in those particular structures, and it's making those calls at a national level. Granted, the process is not 100%. When you enter into negotiation with multiple stakeholder and you're balancing multiple stakeholder interests, you do kind of get into a negotiation and you don't get everything that you want. But it is progressive in the sense that if the trade union voice was not represented there, you would really have a zero-sum game where workers and communities would be on the back foot of very neoliberal government policy proposals. So that's my brief response. Thanks.
Thank you, Comrade. Very, very important additions to the conversation. Comrade Ernest.
Yeah, thank you. I will also delve into what are we doing, the trade unions, how are we shaping the energy policies in our respective countries? Maybe I think it's important to take you back, and I must confess, when our government in Kenya was signing these PPAs in earlier 2000, virtually all of us, the trade union movement, the civil society, and I'll even maybe say the leadership even didn't know what they were signing. And these particular investors took advantage of the situation, the dire situation that was there. And I will agree with the colleague in South Africa. This is where you are now, where the government is deliberately making it to be seen as if the public institutions have completely failed. They have collapsed. So I'm calling upon the trade unions in South Africa that with the experience and with what happened in Kenya and now even Uganda, I think you have an advantage of coming out very strongly and oppose these IPPs. You can imagine in Kenya, we are only lucky that the PPAs are coming to an end, maybe around 2030, another 7-8 years or thereabout. But it's interesting where the payment, the distributing company called Kenya Power pays them in dollars. Others are paid in euro. But the public institution Kenyan is paid in Kenya shillings. Yeah. So this is a major ripoff. And I remember very well, 20 years ago, we started making noise as a trade union and nobody was listening to us completely. We were making noise that these agreements are lopsided. These agreements are fleecing the country. No politician was listening to us. But unfortunately now, it has come to pass. 20 years down the line, everybody now is realizing the noise we were making as a union, yeah, if they knew, they would have supported us that time. Because the power, and that's why South Africans now, maybe you really need to come out very strongly, is the issue of, you see the power, the IPPs, they're telling you, take it or pay. Yeah, take it or pay. If you don't take, you have to pay. So there is what they're calling the base power, almost 80%, that they are guaranteed. And they're saying they took loans, so nothing can stop them. Nobody can revoke those agreements. So as a union, what now we are doing since then is we are fully involving ourselves in the process of reform. And the latest was the Energy Act of 2019, where we're involved. Okay, with our current setup constitution, just like any other African country, there is that public participation. But we went further and said, besides being involved, participating in public participation, we are key stakeholders. So what we also do, because they involve the employees, we make sure that at a shop level, when these particular reforms policies are being brought, we make sure we are involved. At the national level, we are involved, and also at the national center. So that is where I want to say we've reached. But even as we do that, something that is important, and I think a colleague raised about the power mix of 90%. I think a colleague from, is it Naledi or Satu? You see, when I talked about the access to electricity, we're talking about not energy, electricity. Access, Kenyans who are accessible to electricity is now almost 80%. But that does not necessarily mean when it comes to energy, and she mentioned about the situation in Uganda, those local folks, people in the local rural villages, what are they using for energy? It's a different ball game altogether. Maybe you're using charcoal, fossil fuel and all that. So that brings another perspective. But what the government is also trying to do in Kenya is in order to embrace clean energy, they are now coming up with a BRT, bus rapid system. The government has put in, it's been in the pipeline for the last 10 years, but at least now in the coming budget, there are a number of routes that they want to use this now as a pilot project to start off. So that now they can use electricity. We are also having a motorcycle. The border borders, they're called the border border in Kenya. They have started now using electricity. And we also have equally a number of vehicles. The government is encouraging now EV, electric vehicles. So maybe with time, with that particular focus, I think in the next few years or thereabout, we should be doing very well. But something that I needed to mention, which I forgot was the issue of the geothermal. Geothermal in Kenya, there's a lot of geothermal. Geothermal per se, maybe just to understand, it is capital intensive for the initial investment. But now, once the machines are up and running, is the cheapest. Is the cheapest in terms of maintenance. And that is why the government is focusing a lot on that. And we are happy that our experience, knowledge, and skills now, we are exporting to Ethiopia. We are exporting also to Djibouti. And recently, Rwanda also have come knocking so that we support them. So we have our staff who are well trained, who are working out in those particular countries. And when it comes to the geothermal, I think we are leading now in Africa and the whole world. We are number 5, ICE generating the country that has harnessed this particular resource. So I think that is where we are, but it's not easy when we talk about the role of trade union. It is one thing to be involved. It is one thing to make noise, but there is us who listens. And that's why now the colleague in COSATU, I think, let's try. We can't give up. It is our role. Let us look for like-minded organizations. Let us lobby members of parliament who highlight to us. Because at the end of the day, we can't just give up. We have to continue. Through collective bargaining agreements, I'm happy also what colleague from COSATU say. We are also, that is how now we are also coming in. Through collective bargaining agreements, we make sure provisions on matters of transition are clearly taken care of. Thank you.
Thanks, comrade. Very good. And so we'll just turn to Evelyn to take us to lunch, I think, and give us a response to any questions that were aimed at you, Evelyn.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll go straight to, was ESCOM IPP? No, it was a concession. Actually, there was an unbundling of Uganda Electricity Board into transmission, generation, and distribution. So once they formed the Uganda generation company, when ESCOM came on board, it actually took over the concession for 20 years. So it was not an IPP. Then in terms of, interesting enough, in terms of distribution, ESCOM was also part of the shareholders in Umeme Limited when it came to distribution. So it is interesting. So they're both into generation full-time. Then in terms of distribution, they had certain shares. So they were benefiting twice. So there's still money. They can use part of the money they're going to get to make South African sector work. And yeah, so then in terms of the relationship between the union and the government, Uganda is unique in that we have workers representative in the parliament. So that gives us leverage. Normally, if we want to engage either with the parliamentary committee, either on energy or want to meet the Speaker of Parliament, we use them a lot. So that has been the biggest leverage we had in Uganda. In terms of even influencing the policy beyond the members of parliament, we've also learned how to collaborate with civil society and media engagement, but also using informed research. We got researchers and we got the researcher, the lead researcher, to come and talk to the media in terms of the finding on how privatization of electricity has actually brought untold ills and outcry to the public. And when this went into the media, we got further engagement, including, interesting enough, even the companies themselves had to call us, both ESCOM and Umeme, to try to say, look here, we're not the problem is not us. But that was quite interesting. But that was as a result of engaging with the media, civil society, to ensure there is the issue of change as a result of what we're saying. My comrade from Namibia has asked, what made the president change his mind? Was it old age? No. It was the reality on the ground, the reality check. Because from 2013, people realized that the tariff increased by more than 300%. Nobody needs to tell you that. It was written black and white, and people could actually validate it using their bills they were receiving on monthly basis. The number two, When the privatization of the electricity sector came on board, it was not the only one. The government of Uganda was forced to privatize its airline, its public bank, and I know that you're going to talk about that. And he realized that they were using government money, the African Development Bank or Uganda Development Bank, to channel money to the private banks. And the cost of acquiring the loans for the local people was too expensive. And the government, the president was asking, why did you have to sell our local public bank, which was giving loan to farmers at a low interest rate? And that hiked him a lot. And when you also looked at the contract that was signed with these concessionaires, the rest the government was losing more money compared to what they were actually getting into their coffers. And so that became his point of contention. One time I was in a meeting where IMF was talking about blended financing, and they're pushing it a lot through the private sector arm of the government. But the president said, that was 2019, I'm tired of this thing of IMF telling me privateers can do a good job. I'm tired of it. You've kept on giving us this narrative, it has never worked. So can you please change this narrative, because public sector works better. Somebody has said that the public sector workers not perform well. That is a myth, and I want you to demystify that. Whether you bring another company from outside, they'll maintain your same workers to run the same plants. They'll not bring workers from the UK or from France to manage your utilities. And I want to applaud what Kenya is doing. That shows a good example of public-public partnership. If Kenya has built the capacity of their workers to actually train others on geothermal, why can't we do the same thing? Why can't you look at the best practices from the either global south or global north? Because the expertise that you need is within the public sector. It is not within the private sector. Private sector leverages on what you already have, because who trains these people here? They go to the public universities, they go to the public institutions, and the private actors come in and simply increase slightly their wage as they reduce the number, increase the working hours, increase the load, pretend to increase the money a bit. Then people feel energized, then you say, now we are working better. Who is working better? The same workers. You've only, sorry to use that word, manipulated their psyche. Thank you.
Thanks, Evelyn. Thank you. Big round of applause for the front table here for some really excellent interventions. We have a lot to set up to talk about in the coming sessions. Next session will begin at 1:30, Irene. Is that, we're going to try to stay back on schedule? It gives us 45 minutes. I know it's a little rush, but it'll keep us on time if we get back on time, which will be 1:30.
Yeah.
And the next session is towards 100% access. That's the Sustainable Development Goal 7 of the United Nations, public pathway approaches to address energy poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is going to be a very interesting session with comrades from Mozambique, Ghana, Botswana, and Niger making interventions. So we'll see you all back here at 1:30. And
also, comrades, come back on time, because we're going to have a little exciting activity for you at the very beginning,
oh yes,
right after
activity.
lunch.
Yes, I know.
You don't want to miss it. See you then.